The quiet goodbye. Roberto Morales sat in his modest room on the second floor of his son Alejandro's house in Austin, Texas. A thin layer of sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, illuminating the photographs of a life that felt both distant and vivid. These were memories of a man who had once been the cornerstone of his family, a protector, a provider, and above all, a dreamer. But now, at 72, he found himself feeling like an afterthought, a faded photograph tucked into a dusty album. The room had been Alejandro's son Mateo's bedroom before Roberto moved in. Mateo had left for college a year ago, but Roberto still felt like an uninvited guest occupying space that wasn't his. Every time Alejandro or his wife, Mariana, came to check on him, he felt a pang of guilt. Their visits were brief, polite, and distant, always accompanied by the sound of their phones buzzing or their toddler crying in the background. The guilt weighed heavily on Roberto's mind. He had raised Alejandro to be a strong, responsible man, and Alejandro had not disappointed him. But now, Roberto wondered if his presence had become a burden, an unspoken obligation that disrupted the life his son had built. He had overheard Mariana mentioning once, in passing, how difficult it was to balance their busy schedules, while also ensuring he was cared for. She hadn't meant it unkindly, but the words lodged in his chest like a splinter. That morning, as Roberto sipped his weak coffee, he made up his mind. It was time to let go. He had decided he would suggest moving into a nursing home. It would be better for everyone, he reasoned, even though the thought filled him with dread. But the guilt of staying outweighed the fear of leaving. Roberto shuffled over to the window, leaning heavily on his cane. From his perch, he could see the city buzzing with life. People rushed to work, couples strolled hand in hand, and children laughed as they played on the sidewalk. The world seemed so alive, so full of purpose, yet he felt like a discarded relic, a man whose time had come and gone. In moments like these, Roberto's mind wandered back to San Antonio, where his life had been full of purpose and joy. He had met Sofia, his late wife, on a warm spring evening at a church social. She had been wearing a yellow dress, her hair cascading down her back in soft waves. He had been a nervous young man then, fumbling for the right words, but Sofia's laugh had put him at ease. They had danced that night under a canopy of stars, and Roberto had known he had found his forever. Sofia had a son, Alejandro, from her first marriage. Alejandro was just 6 years old when Roberto married Sofia, and the boy had been wary of him at first. But Roberto's patience and love had slowly won him over. One night, Alejandro had climbed onto Roberto's lap, looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes, and said, "Papa, can we go fishing tomorrow?" It was the first time Alejandro had called him Papa, and it was a moment Roberto would carry with him for the rest of his life. Roberto and Sofia had built a simple yet beautiful life together. Their home in San Antonio had been small but full of warmth. Roberto had worked tirelessly to provide for his family, spending his days as a gardener for wealthy estates and his evenings tending to his own small vegetable patch. His loyal dog, Palomo, had been his constant companion, trotting beside him as he worked. Those days had been hard but joyful, a time when love and purpose filled every corner of his life. But life had changed after Sofia's passing. Alejandro had insisted Roberto move in with him and his family, not wanting his father to be alone. At first, Roberto had been grateful. But over time, he began to feel like an outsider in a world that had moved on without him. His body had grown weaker, his memory less sharp, and his once steady hands now trembled. He had become a man who needed help instead of giving it, and that realization cut deeper than any physical ailment. Roberto turned away from the window, his heart heavy. He picked up the phone and dialed the number of a local nursing home he had researched quietly in the evenings. A cheerful voice answered on the other end, and Roberto hesitated before speaking. "Hello," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I'd like to inquire about your services." He didn't notice Alejandro standing in the doorway, a puzzled expression on his face. Alejandro had come to check on his father, as he often did, but the sound of Roberto's conversation stopped him in his tracks. His chest tightened as he realized what his father was planning. Alejandro waited until Roberto hung up the phone before stepping into the room. "Papa," he said gently, "can we talk?" Roberto turned, startled. "Alejandro, I didn't hear you come in. Is everything all right?" "I was about to ask you the same thing," Alejandro replied, pulling a chair closer. He sat down, his face serious but kind. "What was that call about?" Roberto hesitated, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. He looked at his son, the boy he had raised and loved as his own, and felt a wave of emotion wash over him. "I was just looking into some options," he said carefully. "I don't want to be a burden to you and Mariana. You have your own lives to live." Alejandro's expression softened, and he reached out to place a hand on his father's. "Papa, you're not a burden. You're family, and family takes care of each other." Roberto felt his throat tighten. He wanted to believe Alejandro's words, but the guilt and doubt were too deeply rooted. "I appreciate that, Higo, but I see how hard things are for you and Mariana. I think this is the best solution for everyone." Alejandro shook his head. "Papa, I know things haven't been perfect. We've been so busy, and I realize we haven't been giving you the time and attention you deserve. But that doesn't mean we want you to leave. Please, let us figure this out together." Roberto looked into his son's eyes and saw the sincerity there. He nodded slowly, though the heaviness in his chest remained. He wasn't convinced, but for now, he would let Alejandro try. As Alejandro left the room, Roberto returned to the window, his mind swirling with memories and uncertainties. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't ready to let go of the life he had built. Not just yet. Little did Roberto know, Alejandro had plans of his own. Plans that would soon take them both on a journey neither of them could have imagined. The unexpected journey. The morning was crisp and quiet, with a faint orange glow peeking through the horizon. Roberto Morales stirred in his bed, his sleep disrupted by the faint rustle of movement downstairs. He glanced at the clock on his nightstand. 5:47 a.m. Alejandro was rarely up this early unless there was a pressing reason. His curiosity piqued. Roberto swung his legs over the edge of the bed, wincing as the familiar ache in his knees greeted him. He reached for his cane and made his way downstairs. The sight that greeted him in the kitchen was unexpected. Alejandro was packing a cooler with sandwiches, bottled water, and fruit. Beside him on the counter was a large thermos, likely filled with coffee. Roberto's brow furrowed as he watched his son move with purpose, his actions deliberate yet hurried. "Alejandro, what's going on?" Roberto's voice was groggy but firm. Alejandro looked up, startled but quickly composed himself. "Good morning, Papa," he said with a smile that didn't quite mask his nervous energy. "Get dressed. We're going out." Roberto tilted his head, confusion etched across his face. "Out? Where? At this hour?" Alejandro wiped his hands on a kitchen towel and walked over to his father. "It's a surprise. But trust me, it's something you'll enjoy." Roberto's instinct was to resist. Surprises were rarely welcome at his age. He liked predictability, routines, and the comfort of knowing what lay ahead. But something in Alejandro's tone, a mix of determination and excitement, softened his resolve. "All right," Roberto sighed. "But this better not be one of those silly outings you think I'll enjoy but don't." Alejandro chuckled. "Just get ready, Papa. Dress warmly." Roberto nodded reluctantly and shuffled back upstairs. He chose his warmest sweater, a sturdy jacket, and his old boots, ones he hadn't worn in years but couldn't bear to part with. They were scuffed and worn, a testament to the countless hours he had spent tending gardens and walking Palamo, his loyal dog, in San Antonio. By the time Roberto made his way back downstairs, Alejandro was waiting by the door, car keys in hand. "Ready?" Alejandro asked, his smile now genuine. "As ready as I'll ever be," Roberto muttered, though a flicker of curiosity danced in his eyes. The car ride was long and mostly silent. Alejandro played soft instrumental music on the radio, but neither spoke much. Roberto gazed out the window, watching the cityscape fade into rolling fields and open skies. The scenery reminded him of his younger days, of the simpler life he had once led with Sofia. A pang of nostalgia tugged at his heart. After nearly 2 hours, Alejandro turned onto a gravel road that seemed to lead nowhere. Roberto sat up straighter, his curiosity now mingled with unease. "Where are we going, Alejandro?" Alejandro grinned but didn't answer. He pulled the car into a clearing and parked beside an old wooden gate. Beyond the gate stretched acres of untamed land, with a winding dirt path leading into the trees. A small shed, weathered by time, stood near the entrance, its paint peeling but its structure still sturdy. Roberto's eyes widened as recognition dawned on him. "Is this?" His voice faltered. Alejandro smiled. "If there's one thing you've taught me, it's that big ideas are worth chasing." Roberto nodded slowly. "All right, let's do it. But it has to stay true to what this place is about: family, love, and hard work." And so, the cabin began its next transformation. Alejandro and Mariana worked tirelessly to organize events, inviting local artisans to teach classes on gardening, cooking, and woodworking. Roberto became the unofficial storyteller, sharing tales of his life with wide-eyed listeners who came to hear about the man who had built a dream from the ground up. The letter. One chilly afternoon, as Roberto sat in the sunroom with Lucky curled up beside him, Alejandro handed him an envelope. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, but the return address was from San Antonio. "Who's this from?" Roberto asked, adjusting his glasses. "Open it and see," Alejandro replied, grinning. Inside was a handwritten letter from a woman named Elena, who introduced herself as Rosa Velasquez's granddaughter. She had heard about the cabin and wanted to express her gratitude for keeping Rosa's dream alive. "She always spoke of you and your family," the letter read. "She believed in the power of dreams and how they connect us across generations. Thank you for honoring her memory and for creating a place where dreams can grow." Roberto's hands trembled as he read the words. He looked up at Alejandro, his eyes glistening. "It's amazing how one dream can touch so many lives." Alejandro nodded. "That's because it wasn't just a dream, Papa. It was a legacy. The legacy lives on." Years passed, and the cabin remained a place of love and connection. Roberto, though older and slower, continued to be its beating heart. He spent his days in the garden, sharing wisdom with anyone who would listen, and his evenings by the fire, telling stories to Sofia and the children who now visited regularly. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sofia approached him with her sketchbook. She was older now, her once childish drawings replaced with detailed designs. "Grandpa," she said, sitting beside him, "I've been working on something." She opened her sketchbook to reveal a drawing of a larger cabin, surrounded by smaller structures. "I want to expand this place someday. Build more cabins so more families can come here and feel what we felt." Roberto looked at her, his chest swelling with pride. "It's a beautiful dream, Sofia. And if there's one thing I know, it's that dreams like this have a way of coming true." As the stars began to twinkle above, Roberto leaned back in his chair, a sense of peace washing over him. The cabin wasn't just a building. It was a legacy, a testament to love, resilience, and the power of dreams. And with Sofia's vision, he knew it would continue to grow, touching lives long after he was gone. And so, as the cabin stood firm against time, so did the spirit of the man who had built it, his soul forever etched into the wood, the soil, and the stars above. When they arrived at the land, a group of workers was already there, unloading tools and surveying the site. Alejandro introduced Roberto to Carlos, the contractor overseeing the project. Carlos was a middle-aged man with a friendly demeanor and a thick salt and pepper beard. "It's an honor to meet you, Senor Morales," Carlos said. shaking Roberto's hand. "Your son has told me all about your vision. I'm here to make it happen." Roberto nodded, feeling a mix of pride and apprehension. He had spent most of his life working with his hands, but now his body wasn't what it used to be. Still, he was determined to contribute in whatever way he could. Carlos handed him a clipboard with the preliminary blueprints. "Take a look and tell me what you think." Roberto's eyes scanned the drawings. The design was simple yet thoughtful. A single-story cabin with 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and large windows to let in the natural light. Alejandro had insisted on adding a small garden space and a fire pit in the backyard, features Roberto had always dreamed of. "It's perfect," Roberto said, his voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." Carlos smiled. "Good. Now let's get to work." The first step was clearing the land. Alejandro had rented a small excavator, but Roberto insisted on helping with the manual labor. Armed with a pair of thick gloves and a sturdy rake, he joined the workers in clearing brush and debris. Alejandro tried to stop him, worried about his father's health, but Roberto waved him off. "I might be old, but I'm not useless," Roberto said with a grin. "Let me do my part." It was hard work, and Roberto's body ached in ways he hadn't felt in years. But the pain was accompanied by a sense of satisfaction, a reminder of the man he used to be. He took breaks often, sitting on a stump and watching as Alejandro and the workers tackled the heavier tasks. During one of these breaks, Sofia came running up to him, clutching her sketchbook. "Grandpa, look, I drew our house." Roberto took the sketchbook from her and smiled. Sofia had drawn a colorful, whimsical version of the cabin, complete with flowers, trees, and a bright red roof. "This is beautiful, mi Nina," he said, kissing her forehead. "Maybe we should hire you as our architect." Sofia beamed. "Can we really make it look like this?" Roberto nodded. "We'll do our best." By mid-afternoon, the land was cleared, and Carlos announced that it was time to lay the foundation. Alejandro handed Roberto a small, engraved stone. On it were the words La Casa de los Sueños, the House of Dreams. "This is for you, Papa," Alejandro said. "We'll place it at the corner of the foundation, so it's part of the cabin forever." Roberto's hands trembled as he held the stone. He thought of Sofia, of the life they had built together, and of the dreams they had shared. His voice was thick with emotion as he said, "She would have loved this." Alejandro nodded, his own eyes glistening. "She's here with us, Papa, in every step we take." Roberto knelt down with some difficulty, placing the stone at the designated spot. As the workers poured concrete around it, he whispered a silent prayer, thanking Sofia for the love and memories that had brought them to this moment. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. The workers set up the framework for the cabin, and Alejandro and Roberto marked out where the garden would go. Mariana and Sofia planted a small sapling near the edge of the clearing, a tree that would grow alongside their family's dream. When the sun began to set, the family gathered around the makeshift fire pit. Mariana unpacked the picnic, serving sandwiches, fruit, and hot chocolate. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow over their faces. Sofia curled up next to Roberto, her head resting on his shoulder. "Grandpa," she said sleepily, "this is the best day ever." Roberto smiled, his heart full. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive. The land, the cabin, the laughter of his family. It was more than a dream. It was a new beginning. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Roberto looked at Alejandro and said, "Thank you, Hijo, for all of this." Alejandro reached out and squeezed his father's hand. "No, Papa. Thank you for teaching me what family really means." In that moment, Roberto knew that this cabin wasn't just a project. It was a legacy, a testament to the love and resilience that had carried their family through every hardship. And it was only the beginning. A legacy in the making. The months that followed were a symphony of transformation, not just for the land but for Roberto himself. Every weekend, Alejandro drove Roberto to the site, where the foundation had grown into the skeleton of a home. Each time they arrived, Roberto felt a flicker of disbelief that this dream, long buried under years of practicality and loss, was finally coming to life. It wasn't just the construction of the cabin that filled Roberto's days. It was the sense of purpose, the rhythm of involvement, and the warmth of family that began to breathe new life into him. Alejandro ensured that every decision, from the type of wood used for the floors to the placement of the windows, included his father's input. One Saturday morning, Roberto arrived at the site to find a surprise waiting for him. A weathered, familiar object leaned against the porch steps, a shovel with a red handle and initials carved into its wooden grip, RM. Roberto's breath caught as he ran his fingers over the initials. It was the same shovel he had used decades ago in San Antonio, the one he and Sofia had bought together when they first dreamed of tending their own garden. "How did you find this?" Roberto asked, his voice trembling as he turned to Alejandro. Alejandro smiled. "I found it in the shed back at the old house. Thought it might be fitting for the next phase of the cabin." Roberto nodded, tears welling in his eyes. It wasn't just a shovel. It was a piece of his history, a connection to Sofia, and a reminder of the roots he had planted so long ago. The Garden of Memories. That day, Roberto and Alejandro began work on the garden. While the cabin's walls rose around them, Roberto stood in the rich, freshly tilled soil, directing the placement of beds and pathways. Alejandro worked beside him, digging and planting under his father's careful guidance. Roberto's hands were no longer as steady as they once were, but Alejandro treated each suggestion with the respect it deserved. "This garden," Roberto said as he adjusted the placement of a sapling, "will be more than just a place for vegetables. It will be a space for life, for memories." Alejandro nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "What should we plant first?" Roberto smiled. "Tomatoes. Sofia always loved fresh tomatoes. And herbs, basil, cilantro, and rosemary. She'd have us make salsa with it." They worked until the sun was high in the sky, breaking only to share the lunch Mariana had packed. Sofia joined them, eagerly helping to water the plants with a small pink watering can. She made a game of it, splashing Roberto and giggling as he pretended to scold her. The arrival of the unexpected visitor. As the garden took shape, Roberto noticed a dog lingering near the edge of the clearing one afternoon. It was a scruffy, golden-brown mutt with soulful eyes that reminded him of Palomo, the dog he had loved in San Antonio. The dog was skittish at first, retreating whenever anyone came too close. But Roberto had a quiet patience about him, a gift he had honed over the years. Each day, he left a small plate of food at the edge of the clearing. Slowly, the dog grew bolder, venturing closer until, one morning, it sat at Roberto's feet. "Well, aren't you a handsome boy?" Roberto said softly, reaching out to scratch the dog's ears. The dog wagged its tail, leaning into his touch. Alejandro, watching from the porch, laughed. "Looks like you've made a new friend, Papa." Sofia was ecstatic. "Can we keep him, Grandpa? Please." Roberto hesitated. He hadn't cared for a pet in years and wasn't sure if he had it in him anymore. But as the dog gazed up at him, its eyes filled with quiet trust, he found himself nodding. "All right, but we'll need to give him a name." Sofia clapped her hands. "How about Lucky?" "Lucky it is," Roberto agreed, smiling as the dog settled beside him, its tail thumping contentedly. The cabin's heart. As the cabin neared completion, Alejandro insisted on building one feature Roberto had not expected, a small sunroom attached to the back of the house, facing the garden. "This is for you, Papa," Alejandro said as he unveiled the plans. "You always said you loved mornings in the sun." The sunroom became Roberto's sanctuary. On chilly mornings, he sat there with a cup of coffee, watching the light dance over the garden, and the birds flitting between the trees. Lucky often lay at his feet, content to bask in the warmth of the sun. One day, as Roberto sat in his sunroom, He noticed Alejandro carrying a small box into the cabin. Curious, he followed his son to the living room, where Alejandro was carefully unpacking its contents. Inside were framed photographs of Sofia, Alejandro as a child, and moments from their family's past. "I thought these should be here," Alejandro said, glancing at his father. "This cabin isn't just about new memories. It's about honoring the old ones too." Roberto felt his throat tighten as he picked up one of the frames. It was a photo of Sofia in her garden, her hair tied back with a red scarf, holding a basket of freshly picked vegetables. "She'd be proud of you, Hijo," Roberto said, his voice breaking. "Of all of this." Alejandro placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "She'd be proud of you too, Papa, for never giving up, even when it felt like everything was lost." The community comes together. Word of the Morales family project began to spread. Neighbors and friends started showing up, offering help and support. Teresa, the kind neighbor who had often brought meals to Roberto back in Austin, arrived one afternoon with a tray of enchiladas and a smile. "I heard about the cabin," she said. "Figured you might need some fuel for all this hard work." Roberto welcomed her warmly, touched by her gesture. Soon, others followed. Alejandro's friends, co-workers, and even strangers who had heard about the dream of an elderly man finding a new purpose. The cabin became more than just a family project. It became a community effort. People donated supplies, lent tools, and shared stories as they worked alongside Roberto and Alejandro. For the first time in years, Roberto felt surrounded by a sense of belonging, a reminder that he wasn't alone. The night of the first fire, months of labor finally culminated in the completion of the cabin. The family decided to celebrate with a small gathering around the fire pit. Mariana prepared a feast, Alejandro lit the fire, and Sofia insisted on roasting marshmallows. As the flames crackled, Roberto looked around at the faces illuminated by the firelight. His son, daughter-in-law, granddaughter, neighbors, and friends. Lucky lay at his feet, and the smell of freshly tilled earth mingled with the aroma of roasted marshmallows. Alejandro raised a glass. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And to the man who taught us what it means to dream." Roberto felt his chest swell with pride and gratitude. "And to family," he added, his voice steady. "The greatest dream of all." That night, as the stars blanketed the sky, Roberto realized the cabin wasn't just a structure. It was a symbol of love, resilience, and the unshakable bond that tied them together. And in its heart, he felt something he hadn't in years: peace. The cabin's soul. The cabin now stood tall and proud, its wooden frame polished and sturdy, nestled in the clearing as though it had always been there. The scent of fresh pine filled the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of the garden and the faint whiff of smoke from the fire pit. For Roberto Morales, it was not just a structure. It was a vessel of memories, love, and hope. Inside, the cabin was a reflection of the family's journey. The living room, centered around a stone fireplace, held the photographs Alejandro had unpacked, each one a story of the Morales family's resilience. The kitchen was small but warm, with countertops Roberto had insisted be made from reclaimed wood. Wood with a history, he had told Carlos, the contractor, and Alejandro had agreed. But the heart of the cabin, as Alejandro had planned, was Roberto's sunroom. Here, Roberto spent most of his mornings, sipping coffee, listening to birdsong, and letting Lucky snooze at his feet. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could watch the world awaken and feel the steady rhythm of life all around him. The unexpected visitor. One cool autumn morning, Roberto sat in the sunroom, admiring the vibrant reds and golds of the leaves in the garden. Lucky perked up suddenly, his ears twitching. A faint crunch of footsteps on the gravel path reached Roberto's ears. Curious, he stood, steadying himself with his cane, and peered out the window. A man in his late 30s was walking toward the cabin. He wore a worn denim jacket and carried a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. His face, though unfamiliar, carried a certain warmth. Roberto frowned slightly but opened the door as the man approached. "Senor Morales?" the man asked, his voice polite but tentative. Roberto nodded. "Yes. Can I help you?" The man extended his hand. "My name is Gabriel. I believe you might have known my grandmother, Rosa Velasquez." Roberto froze for a moment, the name unlocking a flood of memories. Rosa Velasquez had been a neighbor in San Antonio, a widow who had been Sofia's closest friend. Rosa and Sofia had shared many afternoons over coffee, their laughter spilling out into the garden. After Sofia's passing, Roberto had lost touch with Rosa, his grief too heavy to maintain the connection. "Rosa was your grandmother," Roberto said, his voice soft with disbelief. "I haven't thought of her in years." Gabriel smiled gently. "She passed away a few years ago, but before she did, she told me about you and this land. She said you and my abuela used to dream big, dreams of building something beautiful." Roberto swallowed hard, emotions welling up. "She was a good woman, a good friend to my wife." Gabriel nodded. "Before she passed, she gave me this." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a faded envelope. "She said it belonged to you." Roberto took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. Inside was a folded piece of paper, worn and yellowed with age. As he opened it, he saw Sofia's handwriting, a sketch of the cabin they had dreamed of building. Next to it, Rosa had added her own notes, envisioning how the garden might look. "They were planning this together," Gabriel said. "She wanted you to know that she never forgot your dream." Roberto's chest tightened as he stared at the sketch. Sofia's vision, Rosa's notes. It was as if the two women were speaking to him across the years. "Thank you for bringing this to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Gabriel smiled. "It's the least I could do. If you ever need help around here, I'd be honored to pitch in. My abuela always said this land was special." Roberto nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "You're welcome here anytime, Gabriel. Your grandmother's spirit is part of this place, a gift for the future." That afternoon, Roberto called Sofia to the sunroom. She bounced into the room, her sketchbook in hand, and plopped down on the chair next to him. "What's up, Grandpa?" she asked, her wide eyes full of curiosity. Roberto handed her the sketch he had received from Gabriel. "This," he said, "is something your abuela and her friend dreamed up a long time ago. It's the first version of this cabin." Sofia's eyes widened as she studied the paper. "This is amazing. Did they really draw this?" "They did," Roberto said, his voice soft. "Your abuela was a dreamer, just like you." Sofia grinned. "Can I keep it?" Roberto chuckled. "Only if you promise to take care of it. One day, you might want to show it to your own kids." Sofia's face lit up. "I promise, Grandpa. I'll put it in my special box." As she skipped off, Roberto felt a sense of peace. The sketch, the cabin, the garden, they were not just remnants of the past but gifts for the future. The evening of reflection. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Alejandro proposed a toast. The table was filled with the fruits of their labor, vegetables from the garden, fresh bread Mariana had baked, and salsa made with Sofia's help. "To family," Alejandro said, raising his glass, "and to dreams that never die." The glasses clinked, and Roberto felt a deep sense of belonging. The cabin was more than just a building. It was a bridge between the past and the future, a place where love and memories intertwined. After dinner, Roberto sat on the porch, the cool night air wrapping around him like a comforting blanket. Lucky lay at his feet, and the stars twinkled above. Roberto thought of Sofia, of her laughter, and the warmth she had brought to his life. He thought of Rosa and the sketch that had survived the years. And he thought of Alejandro and Sofia, their love giving him a new sense of purpose. For the first time in a long while, Roberto felt whole. The cabin wasn't just a home. It was the soul of their family, a living testament to the power of dreams and the resilience of the human spirit. And as he closed his eyes, he whispered a silent thank you to Sofia, to Rosa, and to the family that had brought him back to life. A place for generations. The cabin was now alive, not just with its physical presence, but with the laughter, love, and stories that echoed within its walls. Every room told a tale, every corner held a memory, and every detail carried the fingerprints of the family who had built it. But for Roberto Morales, the journey wasn't just about creating a structure. It was about finding a home for his soul. The Festival of Lights. One crisp December evening, Alejandro and Mariana surprised Roberto with an announcement. "We've decided to host a celebration here," Alejandro said, his eyes sparkling with excitement. A festival of lights, to bring the community together and officially welcome everyone to the cabin. Roberto raised an eyebrow, half amused, half incredulous. "You want to throw a party in the middle of nowhere? Who's going to come?" Mariana grinned. "Papa, you'd be surprised. Everyone's been asking about the cabin. They want to see what we've built together." Roberto hesitated. He had always been a private man, not one for grand gatherings. But Alejandro's enthusiasm was infectious, and he found himself nodding. "All right, let's do it." The following weeks were a flurry of preparations. Sofia insisted on stringing lights around the garden, and Alejandro borrowed a generator to power them. Mariana baked tirelessly, filling the cabin with the sweet aroma of pan dulce and cinnamon. Neighbors brought decorations, candles, and even a large piñata shaped like a star, which they hung from a sturdy oak tree. On the evening of the festival, the cabin and its surroundings were transformed. Strings of lights crisscrossed the garden, casting a warm golden glow. Lanterns lined the pathway from the road to the cabin, guiding guests through the crisp winter night. A bonfire crackled in the clearing, surrounded by chairs and logs for seating. Guests began arriving just after sunset. Friends, neighbors, and even people Roberto didn't recognize came, their faces alight with curiosity and joy. The once isolated cabin was now a hub of warmth and connection. A moment of gratitude. As the night wore on, Alejandro called for everyone's attention. He stood by the fire, a glass of cider in hand, and gestured for Roberto to join him. "Tonight," Alejandro began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "isn't just about celebrating the completion of the cabin. It's about honoring the man who inspired it." Roberto's face reddened, and he waved a hand dismissively. "Alejandro, enough of that. People are here to enjoy themselves, not listen to speeches." But Alejandro continued, "Papa, you've taught me more than I could ever put into words. About love, sacrifice, and the importance of family. This cabin, it's as much your dream as it is ours. And tonight, we're here because of you." The crowd erupted into applause, and Roberto felt tears sting his eyes. He had always seen himself as a simple man, one who had done his best for his family, but never expected recognition. To hear these words, surrounded by so many people who cared, was almost overwhelming. As Alejandro handed him the glass, Roberto raised it, his voice trembling but clear. "To all of you, for your kindness, your hard work, and your belief in something as simple as a dream. Thank you." The crowd cheered, and Roberto felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. A new chapter begins. In the weeks that followed, the cabin became a beacon for the community. Neighbors came by regularly, bringing their children to play in the garden or share meals on the porch. Sofia turned the sunroom into her creative space, filling it with drawings, paintings, and little crafts. Roberto often joined her, sharing stories from his past as she worked. One day, Alejandro approached Roberto with an idea. "Papa, I've been thinking, this cabin, this place, it's more than just a home. It's a place where people come together. What if we made it something bigger?" Roberto tilted his head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Alejandro hesitated, as though unsure how his father would react. "We could use the cabin to host workshops, gatherings, maybe even retreats, a place for people to learn, connect, and find peace." Roberto considered this, his fingers tracing the edge of his cane. It's a big idea, Higo. Are you sure we're ready for it? Alejandro nodded. Yes, Papa. This is the land you and Mama bought years ago. The land you always talked about turning into a family retreat. Roberto's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't set foot on this land in over 3 decades. It had been his and Sophia's dream to build a small cabin here, a place where they could escape the noise of the city and reconnect with nature. But life had gotten in the way. Work, raising Alejandro, and later Sophia's illness. The dream had been tucked away, forgotten but never entirely abandoned. Why are we here? Roberto asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alejandro stepped out of the car and opened Roberto's door. Come on, Papa. Let me show you. As they walked down the dirt path, Alejandro led the way, carrying the cooler and thermos. Roberto followed, leaning on his cane but moving with a determination he hadn't felt in years. The air was crisp and clean, and the sound of birdsong filled the silence between them. They reached a clearing where the remains of an old fire pit stood, surrounded by a few weathered logs that served as makeshift seats. Alejandro set down the cooler and turned to face his father. Papa, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I know how hard it's been for you. Living with us hasn't been easy, and I realize now that I haven't done enough to make you feel like you're still a vital part of this family. That's why I brought you here. Roberto's brow furrowed, but he said nothing, letting his son continue. This land was your dream, Alejandro said, gesturing around them. And I think it's time we make that dream a reality. I've been working with a contractor, and we're going to build that cabin you and Mama always talked about. Roberto stared at his son, stunned. Alejandro, I don't know what to say. Why now? Why do this? Alejandro smiled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Because you've spent your whole life taking care of others, Papa. Now it's time for us to take care of you. And this is something we can do together. A project, a purpose. I want you to be part of it every step of the way. Roberto felt his throat tighten, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He looked around at the land, seeing not just the overgrown brush and trees, but the potential, the dream that had never truly died. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him. Hope. Do you really mean it? He asked, his voice trembling. You want me to help? Alejandro placed a hand on his father's shoulder. Of course I mean it. You're the heart of this, Papa. I want you to guide me, to share your vision. This isn't just for you, it's for all of us. A place where we can come together as a family. Roberto's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded, unable to find the words. He reached out and pulled Alejandro into a hug, holding him tightly. In that moment, the weight he had been carrying began to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. As they stood in the clearing, father and son, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the land. It was as if Sophia herself was smiling down on them, her dream finally coming to life through the love and determination of the family she had left behind. And so, Roberto's journey began, not toward a nursing home, but toward reclaiming a piece of himself and building a legacy that would endure for generations to come. The first stone. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity and emotion for Roberto. Alejandro had kept his promise, involving him in every decision about the cabin. For the first time in years, Roberto felt his spirit reignite, the heaviness he had carried. The sense of being a burden began to dissolve as he found himself swept up in plans and dreams. Early one Saturday morning, Alejandro picked Roberto up from the house. This time, Mariana and their young daughter Sofia came along. Roberto was surprised but delighted to see them. Mariana had packed a hearty picnic, and Sofia was buzzing with excitement, carrying a small sketchbook and a box of crayons. "Grandpa," Sofia exclaimed, climbing into the car, "Mommy said we're going to build a house in the woods. Can I draw it?" Roberto chuckled, his heart warming. "Of course, me Nina. We'll make it the most beautiful house anyone has ever seen." The car ride was livelier this time. Sophia filled the air with her chatter, asking endless questions about the cabin, how many rooms it would have, if she could have a swing outside, and whether there would be a pond for fish. Roberto found himself laughing more than he had in years, her enthusiasm infectious.